Hello and welcome to our webinar, Anxiety Disorder Lookalikes, Understanding Symptoms and Anxiety as we head back to school. Our presenters today are Ellen Murphy and Selena Oliver, our Pearson Senior Assessment Consultants. We also have Michelle Deal, our Pearson Manager of Marketing for the Education Portfolio with us today, and she will monitor the Q&A during the presentation. This webinar is being presented in broadcast audio. Please turn up your computer speakers as there are no dial-in options. We are also presenting with closed caption. To initiate closed caption on your computer screen, please click on the box marked CC, click on Live Transcript, and select Show Subtitle. The webinar handout link is posted in the chat box. Please download the document during the live presentation. Please type your questions, concerns, and comments into the Zoom Q&A. The chat box is not monitored for content. Please note that hand raise has also been disabled for this webinar. We will answer your questions live, time permitting. If your question is not answered during the live presentation, please fill out the follow-up form in the link that will pop up after the webinar. Webinar certificates of attendance will automatically be emailed to you within 3 weeks. The webinar recording will be posted on our website within 3 weeks of this live event. Please do not close your browser at the conclusion of the webinar. If you have questions that were not answered or wish to speak to a representative, there's a form that you can complete and we will follow up with you. With that being said, I will turn it over to Selena Oliver.
Thank you, Sherry. Good afternoon to you, our guests. Thank you for joining me and my colleague for this discussion about back-to-school anxiety and anxiety lookalikes. My name is Selena Oliver, and I am both a senior clinical assessment consultant with Pearson and also a nationally certified school psychologist. I'm joined today by Ellen Murphy, also a Pearson senior assessment consultant and a fellow school psychologist. Let's talk about anxiety. What am I anxious about? Well, I'm a little anxious about this presentation. I'm worried that my technology might fail me. I'm having a bad hair day, I might get a bad review, or maybe my content is not on target. I am mediating that anxiety because I know a few things. One, I've taken some steps to ensure my technology will work. My hair is as good as it's going to get at this point. There's nothing I can do about it now. I'm also reminding myself that I've given presentations before that haven't always gone the way I planned. And guess what? I've survived. So why am I pointing out my stress? Well, to point out the almost universal nature of anxiety around public presentations. So in that respect, I'm normal. Normalizing stress is a great strategy. I'm also mentioning it to point out that my anxiety about this presentation over the last few weeks has propelled me to do the work to make a good presentation. This is an example of constructive anxiety. And to point out that, like many of our students who are returning to school, I successfully survived prior anxiety-producing situations, which means that I have the tools to do it again, and so do our students. Although this presentation is not primarily about the treatment of anxiety, I wanted to provide you with some messaging that will help our kids as they enter or return to school. One message is that everybody is a little bit nervous on the first day of school. So we're going to normalize that feeling and emotion. And then we're going to empower our kids by letting them know that, you know what, you've faced new situations before, you've faced new kids before, and you're here, and that's great. The objectives of today's presentations are to identify several anxiety lookalike conditions, to identify the characteristics which distinguish protective and constructive anxiety from restrictive anxiety, and to talk about why back to school time might result in an increased number of referrals for an anxiety disorder. Here's our time-ordered agenda. We'll have a brief introduction. We'll talk about 3 reasons back to school time might increase referrals, 3 characteristics which will distinguish between proactive and restrictive anxiety. I've listed here 3 anxiety lookalike conditions, but we're going to talk about way more than that. And then what do we do when unresolved anxiety meets that level of disability? I'm going to pull up a poll for us. Sherry? I do not see the poll feature on my
Hi,
toolbar.
Selena. Just let me know and I'll pull it up for you.
Yep, I'm ready now.
Do
Thank
you want the first one?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
All right. So I want to get a sense of what you guys are experiencing out in the field. So how intense is student back to school anxiety in your district? Is it mild, meaning most of the students have adjusted and things are back on course? Moderate, you're still requiring some proactive and reactive measures where things are progressing, or still very intense, right? Still a lot of unknowns and daily efforts to manage absenteeism, to manage health room visits, to manage counseling suite visits. All right. And Sherry, are you able to move on to the next question?
Did you want to share the results of this one?
Yes, yeah, sure. All right, so student-wise, we're still seeing moderate responses, a few kids still having intense reactions, and quite a few still kind of in that mild area. All right, excellent. Are you able to move on to the next poll question, Sherry?
Yes, it's been launched.
Yep, it's here. I can see it. So how are the staff reacting? Same type of responses, mild, moderate, or intense? Are you seeing that Sunday night panic that all of our teachers and school psychologists have before the beginning of the work week, high absenteeism? All right, Sherry, what are the results from this one? So about the same. So staff anxiety is mirroring to a large degree student anxiety. So what are kids anxious about heading back to school? Well, for the most part, it really depends on their age and their grade. And if you think about the nature of anxiety as somewhat developmental, you would expect to see some differentiation among elementary, middle, and high school kids. At elementary school, those students are mostly experiencing symptoms related to separation anxiety. They're concerned about the bus, where they're gonna, what they're gonna do at recess, where they're gonna sit at lunch, having to deal with a new teacher. And once we get to middle school, kids are more focused on some of the pragmatic and logistical issues that they're concerned with, such as, many of them now have to open lockers, they're switching classes, they're having to deal with multiple teachers. They're experiencing new students as multiple schools feed into this bigger school, maybe having to adjust for gym class, an increased workload, variable schedules. Many schools at this middle school now start using AB schedules, green, gold schedules, just different schedules. So each day you're not even sure what schedule you may be experiencing or expected to meet. There's concern about navigating the school building on their own because in many situations teachers are no longer providing as much escort. And there's concern about lunch seating, consequences for misbehavior, dress fads, and bullying. And then by the time our kids get to high school, the focus shifts again in terms of what they're anxious about. For high school, much of the anxiety has to do with status, especially with males, and also identity roles. So there's concern about gender identification, what social group they may belong to. Are they going to be the artsy kid, the jock, the geek? What type of participation will they have with extracurricular activities? Are they going to be involved in sports or band or drama, robotics? And again, their status, and also a lot of focus, especially, end of 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, in terms of what they're going to do post high school. So there's anxiety around college prep, getting their recommendations, getting their prerequisite courses, concerned about the SAT exam score, applications for college, financing. And if they're not going off to college, they may be concerned about, are they getting into the military? Are they going to join a trade? Are they going to have any work at all? So depending on age and grade, there are different focuses of anxiety. Regardless of age and grade, COVID has really thrown anxiety to the forefront. So if you think about anxiety as an outcome of intense worry, Then COVID really did a number on our vulnerable kids. Kids may have had prolonged exposure to familial adversities and stressors as a result of COVID. These could include financial vulnerabilities, limited access to food, disruption to healthcare, education, and social routines. In addition, the CDC reported that approximately 204,000 kids lost a parent or caregiver by February of 2022. Some of these kids, unfortunately, may have also had the traumatic exposure to the dying loved one. And for most of us on this call, we've seen more stability and predictability in the opening of the school year. And hopefully that's going to result in less anxiety-producing events. For decades, the school health room has been an oasis for kids suffering from anxiety. And with the advent of COVID, many health rooms have had to take a stricter approach to health room access. And therefore, many kids find themselves without this common resource. In addition, the presence of COVID in the health room makes kids who are anxious about acquiring COVID reluctant to go to the health room for services that they might need, even for physical ailments. So anxiety gets a bad rap to a degree. It's actually a very healthy emotion. Healthy anxiety serves as a protective factor that keeps us safe and pushes us toward greater success. Anthropologists believe that healthy anxiety initially developed as a fight, flight, or freeze response to perceived physical threats. For many folks with an acute instance of anxiety, there may be strong and obvious threat like a fire or someone approaching us with a weapon. In these situations, our body often reacts before our conscious thought can process what's occurring. It's that experience one has when they say that the hair on the back of the neck stood up. These little danger antennae provide an early warning system to help keep us safe. These physiological nuances will also be relevant to our discussion a little later in the presentation about unhealthy anxiety. When these threats are perceived, we react by either fighting off the source of the threat, fleeing the threat, or being too scared to do anything. Healthy anxiety about our current or future circumstances can prompt us to consciously act in proactive manners to reduce future risk. For instance, worry about college admissions may propel a student to push his academic envelope and take higher level courses. Concern about making the basketball team may result in a student adopting healthy nutrition, sleep, and exercise habits. Healthy anxiety can play a huge role in propelling us toward greatness. Healthy anxiety has been the genesis of some great inventions and societal changes. It is said that necessity is the mother of invention, but I think anxiety should get some credit as well. In contrast, unhealthy anxiety leads to poor or risky decisions. Someone with lung cancer who refuses to go outside for fear of skin cancer may be an example of someone who has unhealthy anxiety. For one, there are healthier options to reduce skin cancer risks, like wearing UV protective clothing, sunscreen, hats, etc. So instead, the choice of remaining in the house causes other problems and disruptions to the individual with anxiety and restricts their world. So when does unhealthy anxiety become an anxiety disorder? Well, when it substantially interferes with healthy goals. When making such determinations, clinicians often take into consideration the frequency with which the anxiety disrupts or consumes normal routines. Is it every day, all day long, rare? It is important to note here that an individual with significant anxiety may have accommodated or structured their life in such a way as to eliminate many sources of anxiety, and thus give the appearance of not having any anxiety disorder. For these folks, it can be difficult to identify anxiety unless their efforts to control the environment interferes with the activities of other people. Another consideration is the intensity of the anxious behavior. Is the response to a spider just a startled scream, or does the response include crying, throwing things, refusing to move, washing out all the laundry, and cleaning out the refrigerator? And finally, clinicians consider the duration of the anxiety. Is the behavior persistent and not just an overreaction to a recent transient event? Take our screaming spider victim, for instance. Does she move on from the spider scare once she has left the area? Is she able to reconnect with her activities and obligations? Or does she perseverate on the spider all day long, looking behind corners or crying even though there's no spider anywhere to be seen? Again, a restrictive activity. How common are anxiety disorders in kids? Well, according to the National Institutes of Health, anxiety disorders are the most common class of mental disorders. A survey of teachers indicated student anxiety to be their most frequently reported behavioral mental health concern, followed by oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD. We do note that the prevalence of anxiety increases with age. 1% of kids ages 3 to 5, followed by 6% of children ages 6 to 11, and finally 10% of children ages 12 to 17 are noted to have anxiety disorders. Now that I set the table with some basic understanding of the impact of anxiety in schools, you may be asking what school systems can do to screen for anxiety and anxiety disorders. Universal screening is generally considered to be a fair, efficient, and cost-effective response. The Behavior and Emotional Screening Scale is a universal screener that can be completed in just 5 minutes per student. The beauty of a screener like this is that in addition to screening for anxiety, a school system can also screen for other prevalent conditions like depression, conduct problems, and hyperactivity. Let's take a closer look at the symptoms that are impacted by anxiety. Anxiety impacts the way our body behaves. We call that somatization. It also impacts our emotions, communication, cognition, memory, behavior, and sensory functions. Somatic characteristics are likely the #1 source of anxiety lookalikes. Somatic symptoms include sweaty palms, sharp chest pains, pounding heart, shaky arms and legs, nausea, headache, shortness of breath, digestive problems, lightheadedness, tingling sensations, especially if you've been hyperventilating, tense muscles, fatigue, restlessness, difficulty sleeping. I'd venture to say everybody on this call has had one of those symptoms at some point in their lifetime and may not be anxious. But when you see these in concert together, you're either considering a medical condition or possibly anxiety. In the cognitive domain, anxiety certainly impacts concentration and decision-making. We see lots of indecisiveness and misattribution of risk. It's also the cognitive domain which results in thinking errors which escalate feelings of anxiety. So here are just a few examples of thinking errors. So there's crystal ball thinking, where you're kind of predicting the future, and most of the time you're predicting the negative outcome. Mind reading, assuming what you know, that you know what someone else is thinking, and catastrophizing. That's where a drop becomes a bucket. So for example, someone with a small scratch who's very anxious will catastrophize that, and the next thing you know, they're pretty sure they're going to lose their arm, right? So those are 3 very common thinking errors experienced by folks with anxiety. Anxiety-related emotions like mood swings, hypervigilance for threats, and fear are also common. With regard to behavior, we may see the fight response manifested by aggression. Kids in flight mode may escape or retreat, while kids in freeze mode may do nothing. Other observable anxious behaviors include pacing, restlessness, lip chewing, and biting nails. Memory and executive functions are characterized by forgetfulness, difficulty with recall, and inattention. In the sensory domain, we see oversensitivity to sensory stimuli, a heightened startle response, and hypervigilance for physical sensory symptoms. All right. Let's take a look at some anxiety lookalikes. Health conditions have to be on the top of that list. In fact, it has been reported that in a primary care setting, 45% of anxiety disorders are not properly identified. And they're often misdiagnosed due to those somatic complaints. Health lookalikes include heart issues, hyperthyroidism, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory disorders. Those commonly seen in schools include diabetes, asthma, sleep apnea, dehydration, poor nutrition, high carbohydrate fluctuations, That's why that medical history that we get, or that structured developmental history we get, is so important to really help us consider what this child has experienced physically, and if they do have any of these medical conditions which look like anxiety or vice versa. ERs are constantly faced with folks coming in feeling that they're having a heart attack, and so they have to sort through those pieces. And we're going to go through this list, and you'll see it's a really difficult decision to make if you're just looking at some of these external symptoms. So there's chest pain or pressure that's observable for a heart attack and panic attack, pounding or racing heart for both heart attack and panic attack, feeling lightheaded or faint, weakness and dizziness present in both, shortness of breath for a heart attack, difficulty breathing for a panic attack, sweating, including cold sweats, sweating for a panic attack, nausea and vomiting for a heart attack, or stomach pain and nausea for a panic attack. Both experience this feeling of impending doom. And now we're going to begin to see some difference in the presentation. A heart attack may have pain or discomfort in that upper body, such as their jaw, their neck, their arms, or their shoulders, so it's more localized. Where a panic attack may just experience shaking and trembling over their entire body. And a panic attack also has the added feature of sudden feelings of strong anxiety or fear. So what are some tools that can assist you in making that determination, not between the heart attack or the panic attack? Obviously, you're going to leave that to a medical professional, but any suspicion of a health condition needs to be explored for proper treatment. And the results of a broadband assessment like the BASC-3 can assist medical providers with their findings, right? The BASC-3 includes the following relevant scales that a physical professional might find helpful in their determination. So there's a scale for somatization, depression, anxiety, hyperactivity, withdrawal, atypicality, attention, and executive functioning. Another very common lookalike to anxiety is drug, alcohol, and tobacco use. These lookalikes bring along symptoms in every single one of these domains, right? There are common somatic symptoms, which include sweating, jitteriness, shaky arms and legs, nausea, headache, digestive problems, fatigue, restlessness, difficulty sleeping. Cognitively, we see forgetfulness, poor decision-making, difficulty concentrating, slurred speech. Emotionally, there are mood swings, hypervigilance, paranoia. Behaviorally, you're going to see escape, isolation, and aggression, which is that fight, flight, or freeze perspective. Memory could be demonstrated by poor encoding or retrieval, and sensory hyper and hyposensitivity to light, sound, smells, touch, and taste. So in addition to all of those physical symptoms, an individual who is using drugs, alcohol, and tobacco may also experience a lot of worry about the consequence of their drug use. For example, they're worried, are they going to get caught? Will they lose their job? Am I frying my brain cells? I can't tell you how many times I heard that in high school. Will people be mad at me or stop loving me if they find out I'm doing drugs or alcohol? Will I overdose? So there's a lot of anxiety as a consequence of their condition, but also a lot of symptoms that mimic anxiety. Because alcohol, tobacco, and drug use mimic so many mental health and physical conditions, again, it's important to do a very thorough and comprehensive evaluation. One tool that is available is the Milan Adolescent Clinical Inventory, 2nd edition. This inventory includes a substance abuse proneness scale, which can be used to supplement your other data. This tool alone is not sufficient for an evaluation, but is very informative. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorders and executive dysfunction is another common anxiety lookalike. It should be no surprise to anyone that when we are anxious, we tend to be constantly on guard and alert for threats. And if we're looking around for threats, we're not listening to the teacher, which means we're probably not going to follow directions, which looks like we might have ADHD. So think of this, you've got two kids in class that on the surface, they look exactly alike. They're both looking around the room. But one's looking around for stimuli, maybe our student with executive dysfunction or ADHD, and the other's looking around for threats. That's our student with anxiety. So neither one's following the instructions, but the reason for their inattention are distinct, and they need distinct remedies. Some of the common symptoms for both of these, anxiety and executive dysfunction, are behaviorally restlessness, fidgetiness, impulsivity, such as that flight or fight response, poor emotional regulation, and within memory, there could be difficulty with memory attention and the selection, switching, and ignoring pieces. And also in memory, poor encoding and retrieval, forgetfulness, and short-term memory. Here are some easy tools you can use to look at executive functioning. All of these tools are available on Q Global as well. All right, sensory dysfunction. So if the sensory functions aren't working correctly, the child may misinterpret sensory sensations or may respond in a way that looks like anxiety. Think of flight or fight, right? They try to leave the environment or they try to change it. And it may even look like they're being aggressive. So these are the kids who get overwhelmed with crowds, not because of the social situation, but because of the noise, the smells, the lights, the tactile issues of bumping into someone. So remember those sensory antennae we talked about earlier in the presentation? Well, the sensory antennae for kids with sensory dysfunction may be awry and result in an over-attribution of threat to those sensory sensations they're experiencing. Behaviorally, they're going to want to try to escape from those unpleasant sensory experiences. Some may try to seek out new sensory experiences. They may engage in repetitive sensory behaviors that we might mistake for anxiety, isolation, or aggression. Emotionally, there's an emotional response to the unpleasant stimuli that could be characterized by crying or frustration or irritability. Again, that could all look like anxiety. And sensory, there may be a hyper or hypo response to light, sound, smell, or touch, or taste. So those symptoms, again, are very similar to what you might experience with anxiety. One of the features I really appreciate about the sensory profile too is that there's reporting which focuses on the conduct, the social emotional responses, and the attentional responses within the context of the sensory experience. So this is going to give you some information, kind of like which came first, the chicken or the egg. Is the child anxious because they're overwhelmed by the sensory pieces, or are they more alert and in tune to the sensory pieces because they're anxious? So this is a great tool for helping you to ferret that out. Memory deficits is another process impacted by anxiety. The information processing model tells us that sensory processing and attention concentration occur before memory. So in that trajectory, right? So you have the sensory processing, the attention concentration before memory actually happens. So any interference with those two processes will likely have an impact on how memory skills are utilized in anxious individuals. So you think about someone with PTSD who's very hypervigilant, their filters are very focused on taking that information in and maybe over subscribing importance to events. Anxiety disorders can additionally negatively impact effective memory by causing an overassignment of severity, which gets stored as exaggerated memories. But how does poor memory look like anxiety? So there's forgetfulness as a symptom of anxiety, as well as poor memory. And so you can do a memory evaluation to help sort all of that out. And the RAMBLE 3 is a great example of a tool that will be of assistance to you. Communication disorders are another area which may be confused with anxiety disorders. Common symptoms include difficulty with word retrieval, stuttering, mutism, and babbling. Most people can relate to the flight or freeze presentations of anxiety, but people often overlook that fight presentation. I'm talking about anger. Consider this. Feelings of anger may be a manifestation of severe anxiety. A lot of people don't consider that. For example, the kid who gets angry because the teacher called on someone else first to answer a question. Well, there may be an element of anxiety if that child perceives that his needs are not going to be met. They may be thinking, I'm going to forget my question before I get called on. Or the teacher may not call on me at all, and I'll never find the answer to my question. Many kids can express that they are feeling angry. Anger is a very visible symptom, and adults often help kids label this feeling as anger. However, sometimes the emotion is really anxiety. And exploring this emotion through the lens of anxiety may help the child better understand not only what he's experiencing, but it may help them better advocate for what it is they need. So an example of our little boy who's concerned about not getting called on, what he really needs is information versus getting called on. And being able to express his concern as anxiety and not anger may be a better way to help him manage that and respond appropriately. Beck Youth Inventories is a self-report tool which separates the separate self-report scales for anger and anxiety. All right, so with that, we're going to bounce over to Ellen, who's going to discuss anxiety disorders with us. Ellen?
Thank you, Selena. As Selena mentioned, anxiety is normal and often a healthy emotion. However, when a person regularly feels disproportionate levels of anxiety, it might become a medical disorder. Since we are a few weeks into the school year, any transitional anxiety should be abating. If your students are still demonstrating unexpected symptoms of anxiety, it might be time to consider the presence of an anxiety disorder. Let's talk more specifically about a few anxiety disorders. These disorders alter how a person processes emotions and behave, also causing physical symptoms. Mild anxiety might be vague and unsettling, while severe anxiety may seriously affect day-to-day living. Anxiety is not the same as fear, and the terms are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same. When you feel afraid or fear, the five senses, hearing, tasting, smelling, touch, seeing, all of that information is translated into our immediate environment. For example, when you see a vicious-looking animal running towards you, or you hear footsteps approaching from behind, smell smoke in your house, or feel unexpectedly touched on the back, the limbic system switches on the fear response. While anxiety and fear feel similar, anxiety is a reaction to our emotions versus danger in the environment. And what makes anxiety so confusing is that we can experience it due to something upsetting in the present, and we can experience it from something in the past that continues to influence us. Anxiety is considered a long-acting response, broadly focused on a diffused threat, whereas fear is an appropriate, present-oriented, and short-lived response to a very clearly identifiable and specific threat. There are many anxiety disorders, but today we'll be talking about these six, and all of these six are codified in the DSM-5. We'll talk about general anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorders, separation anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and social anxiety disorder. Let's start with generalized anxiety disorder, also known as GAD. It is characterized by excessive and uncontrollable worry about a variety of events. It is often accompanied by physical symptoms such as headaches, muscular tension, restlessness, heart palpitation, and stomach upsets. Children and adolescents with GAD may worry excessively about their performance and competence at school or in sporting events, about personal safety and the safety of family members, or even natural disasters or future events. Generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by a pervasive and nonspecific feelings of anxiousness. It causes clinical significant distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. The difference between normal feelings of anxiety and the presence of general anxiety disorder is that children with GAD worry more often and more intensely than other children in the same circumstances. Children with GAD tend to worry about the same things as their non-anxious peers, but they do so in excess. These worries and associated symptoms cause significant distress and impair daily functioning. Children with GAD are often overly self-critical and avoid activities in which they feel they may not be able to perform perfectly. They also tend to seek frequent reassurance from caregivers, teachers, and others about their performance, although this reassurance provides only fleeting relief from their worries. GAD is a relatively common disorder among children and adolescents. It begins gradually, often in childhood or adolescence, with symptoms that may worsen during times of stress. And their worries can switch from one concern to another and may change with time and age. Generalized anxiety disorder may result in significant academic, social, and family impairment. If left untreated, the disorder may be chronic and is predictive of adulthood anxiety and depression. Now, for adults, they must experience at least 3 of the symptoms that I'm going to mention, but relevant to our back to school discussion, only 1 of these symptoms must be present for children. And the symptoms are restlessness, feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating and irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance. These symptoms should occur more days than not and at least for 6 months. As with many other mental health conditions, the exact cause of generalized anxiety disorder is unknown, but it is linked to genetic factors. GAD may run in families, and they can inherit the parent's tendency towards excessive anxiety. Current research suggests that 1/3 of the risk of children experiencing GAD is actually genetic. There are biological factors. The brain has neurotransmitters that send messages back and forth to impact the way a person feels. Serotonin and dopamine are 2 important transmitters that, when disrupted, can cause feelings of anxiety and depression. And there's biological factors. The brain, there's temperament. I talked about biological. The temperamental factors are if you have a child who has a temperament that is timid or shy, or who avoids dangerous situations, they may be prone to generalized anxiety disorders than others. And then finally, environmental factors. A traumatic experience, such as a divorce, illness, or death in the family, or major events outside of the family may also trigger the onset of anxiety disorders. In addition, anxiety may be learned and modeled from family members and others who are noticeably stressed or anxious around a child. So there's a lot of ways that it manifests, and the etymology can be very different. Now let's talk about obsessive compulsive disorders. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorders, is an anxiety disorder characterized by both obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are characterized by unwanted thoughts, compulsions by unwanted behaviors. Obsessions are experienced as intrusive, recurrent, and persistent thoughts that cause distress and are disruptive. Obsessions are defined as recurrent and persistent thoughts, impulses, or images that are intrusive and cause marked anxiety or distress and are not excessive worries about real life problems. The person attempts to ignore, suppress, or neutralize these thoughts, impulses, or images, and the person is aware that the obsessional thoughts, impulses, or images are a product of his or her own mind, as opposed to delusional in nature. The individual may take steps to avoid the thoughts. Examples of obsessions include fear of contamination, fear of harming others, fear of asymmetry. These types of obsessive thought should not be confused with the types of obsessions experienced by those with an obsessive compulsive personality disorder, as the motivation for the behavior is different. Nor should they be confused with fixated interest, as you see in children with autism. The motivation for the obsessive behavior in those two disorders is different than it is for OCD. Now, compulsions are experienced as repetitive behaviors performed in response to the obsessive thoughts one is experiencing. Compulsions are defined as repetitive behaviors or mental acts that the person feels driven to perform in response to an obsession. The behavior or mental acts are directed at preventing or reducing distress or a dreaded event or situation. These behaviors or mental acts may not always be associated with the content of the obsessional theme. For example, if the theme is contamination, the ritual may involve mental rehearsing or counting. The symptoms of OCD also need to be ruled out as a result of another psychiatric disorder present or caused by a medical condition or substance abuse. Examples of compulsive behaviors include hand washing, counting, checking, or cleaning. A person typically feels a strong urge to engage in the behavior with the hope of preventing the dreaded event in the obsession. For example, a child may have intrusive thoughts that their house may catch on fire, and as a solution to deal with the emotions generated, feel urged to say sentences that are 8 words in length. The only connection between the obsession and compulsion in this case is the belief that one can prevent the other. As you can imagine, performing such rituals is time-consuming and interferes with the student being cognitively available for instruction. So again, one should not confuse the repetitive behaviors in OCD with those experienced by a person with autism, because the motivation is different. Now, separation anxiety disorder will likely be the most common anxiety disorder we'll see in school. It is the most common anxiety disorder in children younger than 12 years and reported in 4% of the population. There is a developmental separation anxiety, which occurs in children between the ages of 8 to 15 months. This is considered part of typical development and should abate if responded to appropriately by caregivers. Separation anxiety is also normal at 18 months to 3 years, and again at 8 years. In children, the attachment figure they have difficulty separating from is usually a parent or a caregiver. Separation anxiety is characterized by inappropriate, excessive, recurrent worry of any 3 of the following: separating from attachment figures like leaving home for school, fear of illness, injury, disasters, or death resulting in loss or harm of attachment, fear of events that separate them from an attachment figure, like parents going on a vacation, reluctance or refusal to separate from an attachment figure, like to go to school, like school refusal, being alone or with others at home or other environments without the attachment figure, and sleeping away from the attachment figure, as in sleepovers, nightmares of separation, and physical symptoms when separating from these attachment figures that would look like a stomach ache or a headache. The fear or anxiety or avoidance needs to be persistent, lasting at least 4 weeks in children and adolescents, and typically 6 months or more in adults. Yes, adults also suffer from separation anxiety. The disturbance needs to cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, academic, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And the disturbance is not better explained by another mental disorder, such as refusing to leave home because of excessive resistance to change, as you might see in autism spectrum disorder, delusions or hallucinations concerning separation in psychotic disorders, refusal to go outside without a trusted companion in agoraphobia, and worries about ill health or other harm befalling significant others in GAD, or concerns about having an illness in illness anxiety disorder. As with all disorders, the disorder must cause significant interference, distress, and disruption. What about school refusal? When children are absent from school for a long period of time, it may often be due to school refusal or truancy. Neither of these is a DSM-5 disorder, but both may have associations with DSM-5 disorders. Truancy is usually associated with ODD and conduct disorders. School refusal may be associated with other anxiety disorders. The motivation for the absence is also different with these two. Children with school refusal are typically managing their stress by trying to stay near their caregiver. They may have no fear at all at school or in social situations. Instead, they are worried that something will happen in the home or to their parent while they're at school. They will typically be found at home with a caregiver. Another group of children may be avoiding school due to anxiety about what is happening in school, having to read in public, bullying, news of school shootings, etc. These children will typically, again, be found at home or with the caregiver. In contrast, children who are truant are not usually fearful of events at school or concerned about what is happening at home. They are truant for some sort of gain. Either they're going to a job, hanging with friends, sleeping late, doing drugs, or alcohol. They will typically be found outside the home, hanging out or at a job, and they will go outside of the home and hang with other kids, as opposed to children with school refusal, who will just engage maybe in social activities, but in the safety of their home online. School refusal often starts at earlier ages in alignment with what we know about separation anxiety disorder. Truancy tends to happen closer to adolescence, in line with what we know about independence in that age range. Both groups are likely to resist efforts to return to school. Now let's talk about panic disorder. The DSM-5 describes a panic attack as an abrupt surge of intense fear or intense discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes. These attacks are recurrent and unanticipated by the patient. Panic disorder is characterized by physical complaints like heart racing, breathing difficulties, and dizziness. Because of these physical symptoms, the first person to intervene is usually a medical professional, and for children, usually the school nurse. Children with panic disorder often report a sudden onset that comes out of the blue, and they have real difficulty ascertaining the triggering event. Panic attacks can be so scary that children who have experienced a panic attack may become more fearful of having another panic attack than they are of whatever caused the panic attack. The panic disorder cycle is a fight, flight, or freeze. The body reacts before the mind processes the information. There is a trigger, which you're often unaware of. The body reacts first. The child feels a physical symptom related to anxiety, like butterflies or their heart racing or sweating. The child misreads it as a health condition, and they go to the health room. The child then becomes hypervigilant to these physical sensations. They might begin to hyperventilate, pace, sweat, and develop into a panic attack. The student associates the trigger sensations with panic attack and tries to avoid situations. And because they're hypervigilant, they become distracted and have another attack. Soon they become more afraid of the attack than the trigger, which is the true hallmark of a panic attack. The attack is scarier than the trigger. Once that panic attack mentally pops in, then subsequent physical sensations like hunger pains, gas, muscle tensions may be misconstrued as an impending panic attack. And fear of a panic attack may result in avoidance of activities. Social anxiety disorder emerges during pre-adolescence, and it's not just shyness. Social anxiety disorder isn't simply a fear of making or interacting with friends. It is actually characterized by an intense fear of social situations in which the child has the internal experience of being judged or scrutinized by others. Social anxiety is very different from shyness. Shyness can be interpreted as a tendency to be socially reserved and is very common in children. Shy children can be uneasy and quiet around others, but they do not necessarily avoid situations that make them feel uncomfortable. Also, after a short period, shy children usually feel more comfortable and begin to engage. Child social anxiety, also referred to as social phobia, is characterized as a marked and persistent fear of social and performance situations in which embarrassment may occur. The child usually has an immediate fear response in these situations that often results in significant avoidance or distress. According to the DSM, a diagnosis of social anxiety disorders requires that the anxiety interferes significantly in the child's daily routine or cause significant distress. Childhood social anxiety can be described with reference to 3 realms: psychological, behavioral, and cognitive. Psychologically, children may exhibit autonomic arousal in social situations such as increased heart rates, sweating, flushing, nausea, abdominal problems, and muscle tensions. Children with social anxiety disorder are seen as generally anxious and may experience more somatic symptoms such as headaches, stomach aches, and nausea due to their anxiety. Behaviorally, social anxiety can be expressed as avoidance, irritability, angry outbursts, crying, clinginess, and overcautiousness. Also, children with social anxiety are sometimes described by their parents as being overly sensitive to criticism and non-assertive with their peers. Cognitively, children with social anxiety have many concerns about social evaluation, and they're likely to interpret social situations in a threatening manner. Some of the most common fears found in children with social anxiety disorder include fears about performance situations, such as speaking or performing in front of people, like musical recitals and plays. Social interaction fears, such as joining or starting a conversation and interacting with same-age peers. Common types of impairment include having fewer friendships, underachieving in school, low self-esteem, and social skill deficits. Among adolescents, typical fears include formal and informal social interactions, public observation and performance, and situations requiring assertive behaviors. Adolescents seem to have more pervasive patterns of fear and avoidance, as well as higher levels of social distress than either children or adults. Social anxiety is characterized by excessive anxiety around everyday situations. Aren't we all a little uncomfortable if we're in a new situation? And frequent feelings of embarrassment. They ruminate over past events. I said that too loudly. I misspoke, all of that. They ruminate over that. They anticipate criticism and rejection. two types of avoidance. One is not attending or limited eye contact, or they'll minimize their presence by sitting out of view. Also, over preparing, spending excessive time getting ready for a presentation or wardrobe selection, etc. It may be limited to specific events like public speaking, school dances, eating in public, or it may be limited to specific settings like large groups, small groups, lunchrooms, school bus. Most importantly, it results in duress, disruption, and interference with healthy goals. Selective mutism is a complex childhood anxiety disorder characterized by a child's inability to speak and communicate effectively in select social settings such as school. These children are able to speak and communicate in settings where they feel comfortable, secure, and relaxed. More than 90% of children with selective mutism also have social phobia or social anxiety. This disorder is quite debilitating and painful to the child. Children and adolescents with selective mutism have an actual fear of speaking and of social interactions where there is an expectation to speak and communicate. Many children with selective mutism have great difficulty responding or initiating communication in a verbal and nonverbal manner. Therefore, social engagement may be compromised. When compared to the typically shy and timid child, most children with selective mutism are at the extreme end of the spectrum for timidity and shyness. Post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder that can develop after exposure to a terrifying event or ordeal in which grave physical harm occurred or was threatened. All children may experience very stressful events that affect how they think and feel. Most of the time, they recover quickly and well. However, when they experience severe stress, such as an injury, death, or threatened death, or death of a close family member or friend, they might be affected long-term. And this needs to be addressed as trauma, especially with COVID. All right, so with that, I'm handing it back to Selena.
All right, Ellen, I learned so much. Thank you for sharing all of that. Excellent, excellent contribution. So we should all now have a pretty good understanding of anxiety at this point, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna go through these last few slides pretty quickly, but I think you've gotten most of the important information. And now I want to talk about anxiety in concert with other disorders. So we know having a disability is stressful, right? That's its own source of anxiety. There's a lot of uncertainty about how to manage the disability, uncertainty about how that disability is going to impact our short and long-term goals. For this reason, kids who already have an existing disability are likely to experience moments of anxiety related to their disability. So think about a kid with a learning disability who's going to be anxious about being called on in class to read, or going to be anxious about taking their SAT test. We also know that anxiety happens not just in response to a disability, there can be a co-occur with another disability. So in fact, 73% of folks with anxiety are likely to have a comorbid condition. 60% may have one other disability, and a full 27% of kids with anxiety have two comorbid conditions. Anxiety and depression are the most commonly linked comorbid conditions, with between 60 and 75% of kids having both of those. Anxiety is also prevalent with Tourette's syndrome. For this group, anxiety emergence is greatest between the ages of 4 and 10. The energy required for tic suppression, such as trying to hide their tics to avoid social or negative social consequences, results in avoiding social situations, missing social cues, missing instruction, and having unpleasant social consequences as a result of their uncontrollable symptoms. Anxiety is also the most common comorbid disorder for autism spectrum disorders. Untreated Comorbid anxiety has been associated with the development of depression, aggression, and self-injury in ASD. The most common anxieties with autism spectrum disorder are obsessive compulsive disorder, specific phobia, social anxiety, and separation anxiety. All right, so we are going to wrap this up. These are just some summary slides here. I'd like to thank you all for attending. If you have questions, I think Sherry said that she was going to find a way for you to get in touch with us, but here's my name and Ellen's name. Sherry, back to you.
We did get a few questions in the Q&A, but I would like to thank you, Ellen and Selena, for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you, Michelle, for your help with the Q&A. Thank you for your participation. Please leave your browser open, as there will be an action item list that will pop up. Look for your certificate and your email within 3 weeks of this live event. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and this does conclude the webinar. Thank you.